The second group of leaks were from people who were trying to either sell a policy, a program, a weapon system, or to shoot down somebody else's idea.
They try to sort of feed you things to keep you happy and to sort of make you feel like you're part of the game.
Well, accountability is always a difficult thing to obtain in agencies that deal with secret information.
I'm John Hughes. Welcome to the campus of Brigham Young University. This is the latest in the series of televised discussions on international communications issues, sponsored by the International Media Studies Program in the Department of Communications. Today we're looking at reporting that the U.S. press does on the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies. We'll be talking about the problems that reporters face in covering the CIA. We'll be talking about the problems that clandestine services face in being covered by the press. And of course the bottom line is, how well is the public served by this process? We have three very expert panelists today. We have Admiral Bob Inman. He's a former director of Naval Intelligence. He's a former director of the National Security Agency. He was deputy director of the CIA. After government, he held a number of important posts in the private sector. He was asked to return as Secretary of Defense and had a sharp encounter with the press during that process, which in part led to his decision to withdraw his nomination. Among his many other activities, he's an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Walter Pincus has worked for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Old Washington Star, and currently covers the intelligence community for the Washington Post. He's been particularly involved in the case of self-confessed CIA spy Aldrich Ames, and he's been covering the current controversy concerning CIA involvement in Guatemala. He's been a consultant to NBC and CBS. He's also directed several projects, investigative projects, for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Dan Taylor is a professor of political science at Brigham Young University and an expert in the field of intelligence, about which he has written widely. He's been an administrative assistant to a congressman in Washington and a long-time senior staff member and then consultant for the Senate Intelligence Committee in Washington. Mr. Pincus, I think I might start with you and ask you, how does a reporter set out to cover a clandestine agency that probably doesn't want to be covered most of the time?
The first lesson is you have to read a lot. Secondly, you have to sort of keep track of what's going on through people you've met or known for years, either inside the government or out. There's a big retired intelligence community now, so there are a lot of people who've been there. And then you keep track of people on the Hill who are dealing with intelligence. So there are different communities of people.
You don't call up the public relations guy at the CIA and say, tell me what's going on. It doesn't work like that.
Actually, there is a public relations guy at CIA. There's a whole group of them, and they are there to take questions. They don't answer a lot of it, but it's a place to start. But it's essentially a beat that you have to do by using people you know or have learned to know over a period of years.
How about officers inside the intelligence agency, or agencies, the various ones? How free are they? I'm not asking you to disclose sources, but I'm just interested in the mechanics of it.
Or methods. No, what you do, again, Washington's a city where if you've been there a long time, you get to meet people in one case or another. The agency in more recent years, or in fact always, has done briefings privately on different subject matters. So you get to know people who are provided to you at times. And you clearly, if some issue arises, try to talk to them. But it's very hard to just call somebody up and chat away as if it's the State Department or the Pentagon.
Admiral Inman, how is it from the other side? What's it like trying to run a clandestine operation?
It depends on the agency in the process. But for most areas of government, if they're trying to keep classified what they're doing, in some cases it may be long-term strategic plans, bombing targets, or often to cover up mistakes. For the intelligence agencies, there's a third cause that makes this a complicated process, and that's to protect how you collect the information, how you get access to it. For the clandestine agencies, those dealing with spies, human resources, they have both the moral worry that somebody who is committed to work for them may be exposed, identified, and even in some cases ultimately killed. For the technical agencies, it's that the revelation will cause the foreign government to recognize how information is being lost and to change the way they communicate, change their crypto systems. If it's imagery they're trying to avoid, use various kinds of cover and deception. So the part of that makes this the most complicated relationship in dealing with media is the issue of protecting sources and methods. My experience over a great many years was that the essence of a story usually can be told without significant damage. It's how we got the information. That's the sensitive part. In watching a lot of very able reporters over the years, some had their own sense of responsibility about this issue and would be very careful. They would call to say, we've got this story and we're going with it, but will it be damaging if we describe how we got it?
How do you handle that? What do you say?
Sometimes honestly say it won't be, as long as you don't, as long as you're careful to protect how we know. There are others who couldn't resist including how we knew, because they like to impress the other journalists with how good their sources were.
What about the journalist who calls you and says, I've got this story and I'm going with it, and you say, well, if you relate thus and thus, it will be damaging, and the journalist and or his editors weigh that opinion of yours and say, we don't believe that, we're going to go with it? Well,
first, you often don't get that opportunity to go through that entire process. Okay. But there were years when there were mechanisms to do that. And the operating rule was that you weren't likely to be successful in talking to the journalist. There's a lot at stake.
You mean you go to the publisher or you go to the editor?
The editor. Going to publishers also rarely contributed. They're more concerned about how much they're earning, what the profits are.
How about that?
The key player was the editor.
Ever had the rug pulled out from under you by your editor on a...
Oh no, Admiral Inman's walked into the newsroom on stories. Everybody watches it happen, and there were times when we listened to him and there were times when we didn't.
Yes.
But we end up making, at least paper ends up making the judgment.
Yeah, and I think the key, and that was always the case. You have to be very careful that this country doesn't have censorship in peacetime. And in fact, not since World War II have we had it. But you've got to have a real case. And it says you've also got to be candid. You've got to tell the editor exactly what the damage either was or would likely be. And if you aren't willing to do that, you shouldn't make the trip. And just to ask them not to publish it on good faith simply won't work.
How about asking a journalist to publish something that he doesn't know yet that you think would be helpful to your cause?
I was never in that arena. And I think that happens much more from the policy-making side of the government, at least from my experience. There may be people in the intelligence community who call it, they could be susceptible. There were three kinds of leaks that I watched in my years of government. One was from somebody who was disaffected, didn't get the promotion, didn't get the job. And that usually took the form of documents over the transom. That's where Jack Anderson, Drew Pearson got so much of their material over the years. Frequently, that wasn't all that damaging. It may be embarrassing, but not damaging, because if the documents were well written, they didn't reveal how you knew the information in the first place.
Okay.
The second group of leaks were from people who were trying to either sell a policy, a program, a weapons system, or to shoot down somebody else's idea. And most often, they were distorted to make the case. Probably more disinformation in that category of leaks than in anything else the government tried to do at all. The third category, and from my viewpoint the most damaging, were from the appointed or elected officials of government who wanted to make points with their favorite journalist or their favorite editor. And they would, or just impressed with how important they were, how much they had access to. And so they would gossip at dinner parties, at cocktail parties. And frequently they'd just come in, they'd just been exposed to all this flow of data. They didn't know how it was derived. But they would provide the essential info that would send the journalist off like a bloodhound on the story. And the most damaging leaks to sources and methods almost always came out of that third category.
That's the category that a relationship between the gentleman you worked for, Bill Casey, and a colleague of yours, Bob Woodward, of the Washington Post. Was that relationship, and that don't we get the impression that Director Casey talked rather freely to Mr. Woodward?
We know from the record that they had many meetings, that they were almost always at the Casey residence, most often over breakfast from the physical security people. I never could understand why those meetings. Those were all after I'd left government. But an old friend of Mr. Casey's put it in perspective for me. He was a writer himself, a historian. And the best guess was he thought if he could get a positive book from a critical source, it would carry much more weight in history than elsewhere. And that temptation apparently caused him to not only talk, but to let him read a lot of his own personal notes of his meetings.
It's probably a good guess that he wasn't telling Mr. Woodward negative stories about himself or the agency.
During those 2 years, the two things that were going on that Casey never talked about, one was Iran-Contra, and Bob never got a whiff of it. And the other was the beginning of the Ames case, which had Casey very upset, and he never gave an inkling of that. I mean, it was designed, and people do it all the time. They try to, and the agency has done it more since Casey, and it's a big mistake. They try to sort of feed you things to keep you happy and to sort of make you feel like you're part of the game. Well, but it's also the one other thing you're talking about is sources and methods. And the thing that we always have to try to deal with, because it's something we're into, and if you've done it long enough, you recognize it, and that is that we have to make a judgment, because we don't steal this information. I don't know if any reporter has stolen stuff. So somebody is giving it to us, and they have their reasons, and you have to try to figure out what those reasons are, besides trying to find out whether the information is correct or not, because somebody giving it to you doesn't make it correct. The second part of it is that sources and methods like classified information are often used to cover up something else. One of the ones that got the Post in some trouble with Mr. Weinberger was the first shuttle that went, first military shuttle that was shot off. The Air Force announced that nobody was going to be told what the satellite was or what it was going to do. And that was done at a private briefing, really, for television people. It became a big story in the Times and some other, and we had no coverage of it. And the next day, I was asked to find out what the satellite was.
What was in it?
And it took about 2.5 hours, because, in fact, there had been briefings on the satellite 6 months earlier. And, in fact, 2 months earlier by NASA and then by the military to NBC and the AP and Aviation Week. And when Casey and others found out that people knew about it, and Weinberger, they made a deal with those 3 organizations that they would not tell anybody what was on it. And if they wouldn't print it, nobody would know. And so we printed it, and because we weren't part of the deal, and it wasn't that secret. And the next day, Weinberger was on CNN accusing the Post of violating the Espionage Act. We got calls all day.
But we don't have an Espionage Act. And the effort was made to thwart a really useful bill that had been created to deal with signals intelligence back in the 30s. That said, if you actually had access to communications intelligence, there was an automatic penalty up to 10 years in jail if you gave it to somebody who was not authorized. And there was an effort in that time frame that Mr. Pincus is speaking of to try to threaten the media with applying that bill to, if a journalist had gotten the story, to apply it to the journalist. Never in the spirit of the law at all. And that's what helps break down the whole process. On the sources and methods issue, probably the most heated arguments with editors and reporters that I had was they would say, well, gee, if we know it, the Russians are bound to know it. And that part could well be valid. But that method, that way of accessing, frequently, the Russians weren't the only target of interest that you pursued, yet the story would alert the whole world that they might be vulnerable to that same kind of access. And that was where we all sometimes came to disagreement on how to handle it.
Let me ask Professor Taylor, you've listened to this account of this intriguing effort by the press to extract information and, in a sense, make the agency accountable, but there's a whole other structure for accountability of the agencies, and that's Congress, and you're very familiar with that process. Would you tell us how that works and how effective you think it is? Some senators seem to think they're not getting the whole story the whole time.
Well, accountability is always a difficult thing to obtain in agencies that deal with secret information. And I think Congress is probably better equipped than the press to do this. I'm not saying they do it always well. I think all of us can think of historical periods or instances where Congress has been, I think, very effective in its oversight responsibilities. Various factors, I think, sometimes crop up that prevent that from occurring. Partisanship. Any year that can be divided by 4 is a bad year because we have presidential candidates running those years. I think the press plays a very important role in covering intelligence activities, but it's the press is sort of like a match. They can strike a match, but they can't turn on a lamp. They don't have access. They have good incisors, but not molars. They can bite off interesting stories and publish them, but they really can't sustain a prolonged agenda of investigation having legal access to any information that I think is necessary for oversight, and that's what Congress can do.
When you were with the Senate Intelligence Committee, do you ever pick up the Washington Post or the New York Times and read an intelligence-related story and say, gee, I didn't know that. We didn't know that. Does that happen?
Only 3 or 4 times a week, I suspect. We always, we had access to the classified newspapers that are hand-delivered every morning. I think we usually got more out of the Washington Post and the New York Times than we did those. But I think what you're saying is that, or what you're asking about is that we would be alerted to wrongdoing. This is the match I'm speaking about. And the press would do a wonderful job in alerting us to that.
What was the attitude of congressmen who said, well, how come we didn't know that? How come the Washington Post is telling us this good stuff?
It varies with each congressman, and it varies on the instance about which you're speaking. If it's a development abroad that we should have known about and our intelligence agency should have known about, but it didn't come through those sources, there was a lot of concern, and I would get calls from half a dozen senators saying, look into this, why didn't we know about it? If it's a leak or something like this, that's quite a different story. Your earlier discussion, Admiral Inman, reminded me of one of the great instances here of press effort, and that was Project Jennifer, if you remember that. This was the Glomar, the Soviet submarine had sunk in the Pacific, and our intelligence people knew about it. And
you built a ship to go off.
Oh, they got a ship from the Hughes Corporation, actually, but modified it and keeping this very secret for obvious reasons. If the Russians had known we were trying to get it up, they would have been there protecting it, because it had a lot of vital national security, Soviet national security information in it, and it did leak. Probably, well, it went out and they lifted it up, and the submarine snapped in two. They brought half of it back, and were preparing to go out and recover the other half. Probably some sailors on the ship started talking in local bars, but anyway, it got to the press, and exactly what Admiral Inman discussed occurred. That is, the national security people telephoned editors and said, please don't print this, terrible things would happen, and everyone complied except Jack Anderson, wasn't it, Mr. Pincus?
Anderson went with the story.
Went with the story, and once the story was released,
everybody did.
Then everyone, of course, went with it.
Out in the open,
and then the American people were then reluctant to go out and try to recover the remaining, since they would probably encounter Soviet ships there. So.
Well, was that you think that was a legitimate request? Did it in fact do damage to the national interest?
I think Admiral Inman could better comment on that, but from my perspective, I thought it was a legitimate request.
It precluded any prospect of going out to
get the other.
To get what one had not gotten initially.
But some of these, I mean, there are times when we have done it, and there are times we're not. And there are also times when we've been asked to do it. There's a thing going on now that Edward Howard, who's the sort of former CIA guy who went off to, was fired, then eventually went to the Soviet Union, and is living there now, has just written a book. But he, one of his missions when he went over there was to take care of an extraordinary underground wiretapping operation.
Physics lab.
The Soviets' Star City, where they're launching their missiles from. And right after he was captured, the whole thing was stopped. The Soviets found out about it. For years, we couldn't write about that, as if the Soviets didn't know, but they clearly did, because they shut it down. But there are times like that. There's a problem in the Guatemala issue.
But the last one, though, makes the point. That's not the only place that the country would have an interest in using that approach to try to get information.
Well, we had dug the tunnel in East Germany. I mean, it's
but that had been long gone many years.
You don't think they remembered it?
No, they don't. Even as the public's memory is short, so are most guys, particularly when you go a generation or two. That was the Regal, the German table cap was 55. So this is another 30 years that had transpired in the process.
You mentioned the Guatemala case, and that causes me to ask Professor Taylor, how about the question of a congressman who comes into possession of information which the press may not have, and the congressman thinks that he has a crisis of conscience, as Congressman Torricelli has over the Guatemala thing. And I don't know whether the press went first with that story, or whether Torricelli went first, but Torricelli certainly was a key player in getting this story out, and then Speaker is saying he ought not to be on the committee. Tell us about this torment that must go on in the conscience of a House member or a senator about whether to reveal this information, obviously to the press. That's where it's got to be publicized.
I'm not certain there's a lot of torment there.
They do it too often, huh?
I don't know for certain any of the facts in the Torricelli case, so I'm reluctant to say a lot about it. Mr. Torricelli found some information which he believed to be true. He then sent a letter containing that information to the press, is my understanding, or a letter he'd sent to other people he also released to the press. And I think the concern in the institutions of Congress is that if Congress wants to maintain its reputation, Mr. Pincus hasn't come out of his chair here yet to maintain what little it has left of its reputation, to keep serious classified information secret. then individual members just cannot run off and do this without at least having some briefing or investigation so that they know something about the veracity of the information. Now, whether Mr. Torricelli's information is accurate or not, I really don't know.
This is the case, in case anybody viewing should not be familiar with this, is the case in which an American citizen and the husband, a guerrilla, who was the husband of an American citizen, were killed in Guatemala, and the implication is that they were killed by Guatemalan military, and specifically a colonel who was in the pay of the CIA.
Well,
who was a source, a paid source.
Paid source.
At one time.
At one time.
At one time.
No, I mean, there are two things to bring up Congress as sort of the source of the leaks is a kind of old saw. 90% of the leaks about intelligence come out of the executive branch, and nobody's saying close down the executive branch. So they get some poor congressman, and not poor congressman, but they do it for the same reason that people do it in the executive branch and do it much more. This one is tricky because it covers a period of time. It covers a period of time when he was on the payroll. They cut him off the payroll. The second, the murder of the guerrilla leader took place after he was cut off, and they had no contact with him, and nobody knew that he was married to an American. So there are a lot of mitigating circumstances. What's interesting about this one, when they did get into trouble, and it goes back to sources and methods, because when the administration, the agency first and then the administration, learned about the fact that the husband had been killed, it was information they got from another source of the CIA. And release of knowledge of that would have endangered him. So the question is, who do you tell that to? And so they tried to find a way to do it by having the State Department say to his wife that they think he is dead. And that was a formulation that supposedly protected, but they couldn't tell her anything more specific unless they could get her approval that she wouldn't tell anybody else. And so sources and methods becomes a very complex game sort of inside the business.
So does congressional oversight. And let me, if I may take you back to the issue of an individual congressman electing to release what he has received as classified information. Back in the 70s, when we went through an extensive period of investigation of both real and alleged abuses of intelligence agencies over 25 years, the experience, both from the congressional point of view and the executive point of view, left a lot to be desired. On the Senate side, senators were pretty circumspect. I'm sorry, the staff was very circumspect, but a lot of the senators leaked.
Thank you.
On the House side, the House members were pretty circumspect, but the staff leaked. So in setting up the permanent committees, both bodies enacted resolutions, and this was to make the executive branch calmer about dealing with this new process. Resolutions that said individual members would not unilaterally release classified information. It would have to go back to the committee. The committee could decide to release it over the objection of the executive branch, but an individual member could not. So I don't know what ground rules Mr. Torricelli is operating under that let him release with no penalty or no punishment. I know for certainty that in earlier times of Democratic leadership, members were taken off the committee because they leaked information and were so identified. In the Senate, I know of a case where a senator was asked to leave the committee early. And in the House, in the House, a couple of cases where the members simply couldn't resist a television camera, couldn't pass one by. And so they simply made the decision to take the speaker, took them off the committee when the next shuffle came, and didn't keep them on. If you look at the performance over the now almost 20 years since this process began, where the chairman and the vice chairman, in the case Senate, or ranking minority in the case of the House, when they were infrequently on television, oversight worked. And when there was a foot race, as soon as the hearing was over, or lots of open hearings, because the process deteriorated. And because it took on at least the image, if not the reality, of being a device to gain coverage for political gain, as opposed to oversight of what was going on.
Ms. Pincus, did the press have a whiff of the Guatemala story before Torricelli came out? Was any of that in the public domain, or was it rumored or whispered?
No. The wife of the guerrilla leader had gone on a hunger strike, so there had been stories, and she had alleged some government involvement in the fact that she wasn't being told. Torricelli is using as his rationale the notion that although committee members had been briefed on the case, he hadn't been in those briefings, and he had learned his information independently from sources, I assume, inside the government, and not from committee members. And that's what he was hanging on to when he sort of went public with what he went public with. He then probably complicated his problem by making allegations off an anonymous letter on National Security Agency stationery, which alleged a whole other range of things which have not proved to be true. So his situation is much more complicated. But I want to go back to this whole business of who releases what. The executive branch makes a habit of releasing things when it's helpful to forgetting all these things. I mean, the classic is Libya and how we found out that Gaddafi and those people were involved. The president himself did it. Well, he has the right to do it. But it undercuts the coin that we've got to worry about all the time about sources and methods.
Do you think the Guatemalan story should have come out? And if so, how should it have come out then properly?
Well, there's no proper way for something like that to come out. I mean, this is sort of, we had a relationship with a very difficult and nasty regime. It was heightened during the Reagan-Bush administration because they were useful for that administration's war against the Sandinistas. You crawl into bed with very strange people when you allow yourself to use them to help something else. And that creates relationships. They had their own problems. They're beating up on their interior people. It's a long-time fight between the Spanish and the Indians in Guatemala. And the Spanish-speaking army wants to stay in power. And the Indians want their rights. You can't get involved in all the issues, but if you're going to stay in touch with the government, you got to deal with a nasty government. Now, what happens after that? From the way I understand it, the agency, in fact, acted fairly rationally. When they found out the first American was killed and this colonel was involved, they cut him off, stopped paying him. Went to the Justice Department, asked what should be done about it. Justice Department studied it for I don't know how many months. The agency went back and said, what's your decision? They finally said, we can't prosecute him, and we'll leave the rest up to you. The agency cut off all contact with him. But the way the agency works, if you work for the agency, you accumulate a certain amount of money. You only get paid, like all agents, a percentage, because they don't want you running around with a lot of money. So after he was cut off totally, they made a once final payment to him. And in
money that was his due.
Money that he had earned. Yeah. And in the stories that came thereafter, and partly because the agency couldn't explain its role, the stories seemed to appear to say he was paid even though they knew he killed somebody. And then there were stories that said he stayed on the payroll. The second murder took place after the cutoff. It's a very difficult story to write unless you know all the facts. And people began demagoguing it to death, and then it took on another air to it. That's the problem of covering the agency. It's a very subtle kind of thing, but the problem is they do wrong things. And those wrong things ought to be exposed.
Would you find people within the agency who would background you on this story if you were digging into it? Would you people say?
Yeah, that's how I know.
That's how you know about it. Okay.
But that's because the thing about us, the people that write about it, is that unlike the agency, everything we do is in public. So people read the paper and they decide whether they can trust you or not. Mm-hmm. And that happens every day. But the agency in the last 3 years has been in great trouble because they don't know what their role is in a post-Cold War world. And there are more people that come to me and other people with stories because they're all disturbed. They really don't know what's happening to them.
How about a more clear-cut case? Mr. Ames, self-confessed spy, mole in the CIA, no question giving information which in fact caused the death of a number of American informants or agents in the then Soviet Union. Did the press have a whiff of that ahead of the game, or was that how was that broken?
No, I started covering it the day after he was arrested, and it was a surprise and a shock. But he is, and I used him in the paper. He's a metaphor for where the agency has moved itself. He's somebody who actually, it's classic because he's very bright. He's a very cunning fellow. But as soon as he was arrested, the agency leaked out stories. He was drunk and no good, and he was really awful, and created a different kind of picture than he really was, and made their life more difficult. Because it then raised the question, how can a guy who's so drunk and terrible, stay in the agency for 20 some odd years and work his way into these positions? Well, the fact of the matter is he's quite cunning. He's very good handling Soviet affairs. He just needed money and decided this was the way to do it. And he worked out a plan. It was very clever. And based on how the agency's internal security worked, which he knew very well, and how the FBI worked covering it, he carried on for almost 9 years.
If someone had come to you 6 months before his arrest and said, hey, this is going on, and this guy is there, he's a mole, he's doing great damage to the United States, would you go with this? Would you have gone with the story?
No, you've got to make sure it's true.
It's got to be straight, right?
Yeah, I mean, people come to you with all sorts of stories trying to finish off their enemies. And sometimes they're friends. No, you have to check. It's quite a serious charge to accuse somebody.
But you check out the story and it's correct.
Sure.
Now, what will you say about that, Admiral?
No, the answer is yeah, you probably would, except...
Well, but would you favor going with it?
No, there's a factor that I think he would respond to because of the experience we have of this Foreign Service officer for whom slowly information was acquired that he was dealing with foreign intelligence services. And they began an effort to put together the kind of information that could build a case to prosecute. And the only hard evidence at that point, as I understand it, was a wiretap of a conversation with his wife. And under the interpretation, that could not be used in prosecution when he was confessing some things to his wife. After the story was leaked, went with the press, and they were never able to make a case.
To get him. Mm-hmm.
So he, he's not getting his retirement, a lot of the rest of it, but he avoided going to jail. In the Ames case, once they became aware, they moved very slowly. But the motivation in moving that slowly was to try to make sure they had an absolute airtight case to prosecute before they finally moved. And it took quite a number of months to build that once they had finally settled in. Now, if the story had happened in the middle of that, I would have made a pitch for them to hold...
You would have gone to the Washington Post and said,
whatever, and say, and explained. Yeah, yes, and if, with a little bit more time, we think we'll be able to put together the solid case that will stand up in court to prosecute. And I suspect under that circumstance, if you'd gone, the other would probably said hold.
Well, there are two. I can always give you another side of every story. There are people I know that knew back in '86 when they started losing agents, that there was something wrong inside. And inside the agency, the decision was made to move very slowly because they had just lost, Edward Lee Howard was this fired guy who they actually knew about, focused on. The FBI had him under surveillance, and he escaped. But when he escaped, that was the end of it. There were people who said back in '86, let's turn up the heat, let's let's put everybody on a lie detector, let's make it clear we're going to find out who's doing this, and if he flees, because that's the end of it. He's not here anymore. And the fact of the matter is that even in the midst of this very slow process, he turned over more information from whenever it was, May of '93 to February of '94, at least in the first May to October period, he turned over 3 big batches of information while the investigation was on. So if he had fled, you would have saved that much. The fact that he is now in jail, in solitary. I saw him 2 weeks ago, and you wouldn't know he's facing a life in prison. He's got 5 books being written about him, 2 movies. It's unbelievable, and he's there to be interviewed.
Let me take this a step further.
You'd do better if he was hiding out in Moscow.
Take it a step further, the whole process. It wasn't swept under the rug. There were ongoing efforts, and finally, but they weren't going fast enough. So finally, Senator Boren as chairman and Senator Cohen as vice chairman of the Senate Select Committee in 1989, because they couldn't get that much interest from their own committee members, chartered a blue ribbon panel to look at the whole process of counterintelligence and dealing with it. Eli Jacobs chaired it. I was the purely vice chair. A.B. Culverhouse, Cy Weiss, Dick Helms from the conservative side, Warren Christopher, Lloyd Cutler, Saul Lenowitz, Jim Woolsey. We met for many months. We looked at every espionage case since the 30s. And what we found was in the 30s and 40s, if Americans got involved, they did it because they were blackmailed or because they had an ideological sympathy. You began to get the shift in the 50s, early 60s. From the late 60s on, there's not a single case of blackmail.
That's money.
It's for money, for lifestyle. And suddenly you're not dealing with people who are recruited, you're dealing with volunteers. And so there were proposals for 13 pieces of legislation. They were introduced by Senators Boren and Cohen that would have let you get to the heart of the matter. Anybody who serves in the intelligence community has to give up some of their privacy. So you have access to financial records. You compel reporting of any bankruptcy proceedings. You compel reporting to the agency, notify that they're an employee. The whole array of things that tell you unusual wealth or extreme financial distress. Legislation did not go forward because a couple of the members objected. Cold War's over. That's too intrusive into the privacy. And the bills were never enacted. Had they been, the prospects of picking off Ames or any other ones out there would have been far better.
On the other hand, right after the Ames case, they immediately included physical searches in the old Foreign Intelligence Security Act court, just because of the Ames.
Yeah.
Which
Professor Taylor, would the House and Senate Intelligence Committees have been briefed on the progress of the Ames investigation? Is that something that they would have expected to be briefed on?
Well, when I was there, we were briefed on a lot of things, but I don't know, Admiral Inman.
Well,
I
my question is would the
would we have
CIA trust?
expected it,
Would
you mean?
would the CIA be comfortable with?
No, I don't think they'd be
Congress,
comfortable briefing
Depends
us
on the time and
on an ongoing investigation. That's my experience.
The fact is, in '89 and '93, of the senior Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee asked about the losses in Soviet assets and Soviet operations, and the agency stiffed them and didn't tell them, and now there's an investigation about why that happened. But they asked, and they were not told. On the grounds it's none of their business.
In the course of the work you do, you accumulate a lot of information, and we've heard from Professor Taylor maybe information that Congress doesn't have. Anybody from the CIA ever asked you to make available that information or share that information?
No, I'm trying to think of some time. I covered the hostages in Tehran in '79. I was in Tehran for, I don't know, 3 weeks, and learned some things there that I went over to ask the White House about. In terms of a question, but it was things that they didn't know about. And that's about as close as
the CIA
it's really come.
John Scaly, of course,
Well, yeah, but that's
played a major role at one point.
Intermediary, yes.
There are rare occasions. Mr. Pincus mentioned early in the program the briefings. Through the years, not so much during Mr. Casey's time, but I think most other periods, there was a process, not from the clandestine service side, but from the analytical side, to provide background briefings for people. They were going to go be stationed abroad.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to go be in a place to give them a general feel for the area in the process. Some of it was altruistic, some of it was hopeful that there might be some flow back at some point in time. There's been great caution since the mid-'70s, in the time of the Church and Pike Committee investigations, not to recruit journalists as sources, or more specifically, not to use journalism as a cover for your own agents. But
it's
but
illegal,
the whole
isn't it illegal to approach
it's an executive order.
Executive order.
Said you will not do it.
And it's also in DCI's standing orders that you cannot recruit journalists or use journalists as cover or recruit certain kinds of journalists to do intelligence work for you. But the pre-briefing...
I've probably had a half dozen times over the years where either a journalist would approach me for help or guidance in where they should go or what they should do. And almost always it was if they'd been in a very sensitive post.
The interesting thing, John, is that why these problems occur is that they're both in the same business.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly it.
I mean, they're both doing the same. They're both going out trying to collect information from sources that prefer to remain anonymous, and but they use it for different purposes.
But the journal. Remember that many of the other countries do use journalists as spies, and therefore they don't really believe we don't do it.
Sure.
And it's a real hazard for a journalist. It was at least in earlier times, when the Soviet Union was still together. And there were a couple of very able reporters who had exactly that problem. They developed good sources, and they were promptly moved on and thrown out of the country, or effort made to entrap them. And I'm very comfortable from looking at the record in the two cases. They had no relationship with the intelligence agencies at all. But Soviets didn't believe that.
No.
And they simply said, I'd try to entrap them, and then
and of course you had this whole process, which was quite skilled on the part of our Russian friends, of planting disinformation in newspapers, particularly Third World.
Yeah.
You plant a story, a scurrilous story. In fact, I think we had the one in India where they planted the story that that there was this massive computer in the embassy in Delhi run by the CIA, which had dossiers on every citizen of the Indian subcontinent, and ran in a Indian newspaper. Of course, TASS is waiting, picks it up, sends it back to to Moscow, and it's on the TASS service as being as emanating from an Indian newspaper.
But they're not the only people.
They're not the only people.
Yeah,
sure.
It's a technique that everybody uses.
But I remember, was it Phil Galen once who said something about if you could recruit a foreign Pravda journalist, go for it. They're not covered by the First Amendment.
You've all talked.
So it doesn't apply to foreign journalists. What I'm saying, it applies to American journalists.
You've all talked a bit about the question of reform of the intelligence agencies and figuring out a new direction. And we have the Aspen Committee, Liz Aspen's committee, looking at the future. Where do you think this reform effort should go, Professor Taylor, in your experience? What do you think?
Well, I hope that we don't do away with either intelligence or especially counterintelligence merely because the Cold War is over. We all remember Lord Palmerston's old adage that there's no such thing as eternal friends, there's no such thing as eternal enemies, there are only eternal interests. And the United States has serious global national interests that it needs to further by the collection of intelligence, and that needs to strengthen by the prevention of espionage in the United States. I personally hope we don't get into the business of economic intelligence. I think that's just fraught with difficulties, and to imagine CIA people reporting on foreign firms, reporting back on market opportunities for certain American companies, to me that's not only a foolish thing, but an imprudent thing.
The odds that they're doing it confidently are low.
Yes, that's right.
And who's the American company you provide it to? The Paris office of a U.S. firm, and not to Toyota, Marysville, Ohio. Yeah. So the whole idea is kooky in my
American Motors owned by
we've dabbled a bit in it.
Oh, we hear it constantly.
How about these 5 quote diplomats unquote being expelled from France?
My understanding is they were trying to find out where the French were doing their spying and for whom. It was essentially a counterintelligence problem that backfired. There are changes that have to be made. There are a lot of changes that can easily afford to be made. Probably the largest one is the reality that we had to rely on clandestine collection, on getting spies to get access into countries that had very effective security systems. Now you've got, in what used to be the Soviet Union, you've got 15 independent republics. You can travel pretty well, uncomfortably, but travel almost anywhere in the process. But you've got to have language ability. It isn't just Russian in Moscow. So the retraining of a workforce, and to do open collection, frankly, my view, we need an awful lot more foreign service officers with language abilities out as political officers, economic officers, cultural affairs, commercial attaches, as opposed to the size of the clandestine agent nets. We still need some of the clandestine agent. It can be both smaller, and it has to be a lot more efficient and effective than it's been in the last decade.
It's essentially become a bureaucracy. Intelligence is now a bureaucratic function of government, and to some degree filled with career people. The agency itself grew by 30% between 80 and 86. So all those people are fairly new. And then the Cold War is over. And the question is, what do you do with them? And like every other agency in government, they've got to be cut back, and they've got to be cut back rationally, but their functions are enormously changed. And nobody is really focused on that. It's partly what the President's Commission that Les Aspin's running, is supposed to do. But meanwhile, you've got to pick up the pieces of what's there, and the agency itself is going through bureaucratic problems. I mean, the women have just settled a gender discrimination lawsuit, which is kind of unheard of in the agency. And there's even disagreement inside the agency women about whether the settlement was done right. It's one of these weird things that nobody knew who was part of the settlement and who wasn't. But the idea that your senior intelligence service is racked by gender discrimination that becomes public, or an agency station chief who was a woman gets into an open sort of legal suit against the agency itself, is a sign that they've lost the reason for their real being. I mean, the reason you're secret is because you're doing something that's so important that it takes you out of the realm of the Agriculture Department or the Commerce Department.
But
and they've lost that.
There are still crises in this world. And there are other areas, may not be clandestine human intelligence at all, but we've discovered painfully what's trouble you can get into when you go into Somalia and don't really know what's happening. Or a variety of other countries, where you need timely warning. Before it was of the Soviets about to move forces or fire missiles. Now it may be of whether Saddam Hussein is going to fire Scuds at Saudi Arabia or Israel in the process. So they're very different kinds of problems, but often they still have enormous import to the country and great time sensitivity.
But nobody's refocused them on those very narrow issues that are important. And unless they do it, unless they cut back, these other mistakes are going to give more sort of heat to the notion of sort of get rid of the whole thing. You never should and you never will get rid of intelligence, but you've got to rationalize it in a way that and really quicker than you do all these other non-intelligence agencies.
Sadly, we're about out of time, but last question for Admiral Inman. I mean, how good do you think press coverage of the agency is across the world? I can't ask Mr. Pincus because he's got a vested interest, but let me ask you.
It varies very much according to paper. A few do good coverage, not many.
So there's a lot out there that's not, how do you feel about that, Professor Taylor?
I would agree with Admiral, and I've seen a lot of very shoddy coverage. I've seen some brilliant work.
Yeah.
They suffer from this access. They don't have legal access to the classified information. It makes it very tough.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much, Professor Taylor, Mr. Pincus, Admiral Inman, for shedding light on the situation we don't always know a great deal about. Thank you very much for being with us. I'm John Hughes for the International Media Studies program at the Department of Communications, Brigham Young University. Thank you.